Good afternoon, everyone. Now, in the last class, we were talking about Bengal, right? We started discussion on the Battle of Plassey, right? Now, Battle of Plassey, we discussed the major events leading up to the battle. Now, what we are going to do is firstly talk about the causes of the Battle of Plassey, and then we'll talk about some of the events that followed after the Battle of Plassey and led to the Battle of Buxar. So don't write in the timeline that we were writing, right? We have written till 1757, leave another page there because we'll complete it till 1764, okay? We'll complete it till there. And only later we'll, so leave a page, we'll come back to it, okay? And we'll write the causes on a separate page. So this is again to differentiate that events are different from causes. And again, don't always think that they're the same, okay? And because when you're revising later, you can have the whole chain of events from the start till the end in one go, okay? And you can look at the causes separately, okay? So let's talk about the causes on the basis of the events that we have discussed till now. So in terms of the causes, you should firstly know that we talk in terms of causes in most of the cases, to the extent possible, we talk in terms of political and economic causes, okay? And yes, even here we can talk in that sense. But also, so for example, when we talk about the interests of the Jagat Seth brothers, that they felt that their economic interests would be hampered, that is what? An economic cause. Or we talk about the political cause, is the emergence of the succession dispute after the death of Ali Vardi Khan, right? So we talked about that how after the death of Ali Vardi Khan between Ghasiti Begum and Siraj-ud-Daulah, there is a political dispute, succession dispute which emerges. So that is also, all of this story is beginning only after the death of Ali Vardi Khan. So as long as there is a strong central ruler, there is no such political dispute which allow the British to try and increase their influence, or the Jagat Seth brothers giving ideas to Jagat Seth brothers that they could increase their influence. So all of this is happening after the death of Ali Vardi Khan and the emergence of the succession dispute. So that is a political cause, right? Another political cause is also the friction between Jagat Seth brothers and Siraj-ud-Daulah, as the young Nawab was more assertive in his approach than what the Jagat Seth brothers were comfortable with, right? So that is also a political cause. In economic cause, we can say that one economic cause is the threat that the Jagat Seth brothers perceive to their economic interests. The other economic cause is also what? Is the Anglo-French rivalry, as both wanted a trading monopoly in the region, because if they had the trading monopoly, they would have greater economic profits, right? If the British were only the traders, then there would be no competition from the French, and they would be able to capture the market better. Similarly for the French. So there is the economic interest or the economic cause is also the rivalry between whom? Between the British and the French. So that aspect is also there, right? So in this context, what you particularly see, that you can write like this also, political and economic causes, and it is ultimately the same, or you can write directly other causes, directly as we are going to discuss. So in my sense here, it's better that if you write only in terms of the causes that we are discussing. Later we can group them up in political and economic causes, okay? So in terms of causes, we say the first major cause is the lack of, or one could say the absence of, a strong central ruler after the death of Ali Vardi Khan, that resulted in the emergence of succession dispute, right? This is one cause, and you can elaborate on this further with the whole things that we have written before in the events already, right? About Ghaziti Begum and Siraj-ud-Daulah, etc. Then another major cause for this whole issue emerging is the Anglo-French rivalry, not just in the economic domain, but also the imperial rivalry between the English and the French. Now here the rivalry is not merely in economic interest between the French East India Company and the British East India Company. Yes, there is economic rivalry, but there is a larger imperial rivalry at play also, that both want to increase their influence in as many regions. The British Empire and the French Empire both want to increase their influence. So that is also the competition which is driving their increasing engagement in the region, and which also becomes a part of the politics of the region. So, and it is here that the Anglo-French rivalry, to increase their imperial presence in the region saw both sides making attempts, the Anglo-French rivalry to increase their imperial presence in the region saw both sides making attempts to influence the domestic polity of Bengal to obtain trading monopolies and drive out their European competition out of Bengal, right? So that is another cause. Apart from this, apart from these two causes, you see the third major cause is the assertive policies of the young Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah, which threatened the hold of Jagat Seth, the assertive policies of the young Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah, which threatened the hold of the Jagat Seth brothers over the court of Bengal and its economic policies. And fourth is the fourth cause is the perceived threat to British economic interests, as Siraj seemed unwilling to grant British a trading monopoly in the region. The next line that I am writing, I'll explain it later as we discuss Hyderabad after this. The British feared being outsmarted by the British East India Company feared being outsmarted by the French East India Company, as was the case in Hyderabad or Carnatic region at this time. These are the causes. Clear? Now, these are the causes for the Battle of Plassey. Now, these are the causes for the Battle of Plassey. And when we'll talk about the Battle of Buxar, we'll add, see, I don't think so that they'll ask you in the mains examination separately the causes for Battle of Plassey or separately a question for Battle of Buxar. They will ask you a question like this, that discuss the factors which triggered a conflict between European powers and the state of Bengal and its implications for 18th century India. So, Battle of Plassey and Buxar, their causes are interrelated. These all are the causes of Battle of Plassey. What happens after this leads to the Battle of Buxar, and we'll talk about it. Okay. Now, let's first talk about the impact of Battle of Plassey. The impact of Battle of Plassey is that Mir Jafar is coming to the throne. Okay. And let's firstly complete the timeline that we were doing, then we'll come to the writing the impacts and everything later. Okay. So, we had written till 1757, right? Now, we'll take it forward from 1757 to 1764. Okay. Now, firstly, whenever you win a war and you impose a defeat on your opponent, you extract a cost for it. Okay. You extract a cost for it, and to that extent, and extracting a cost for it was something that the British East India Company also aimed to do. And that is why they resorted to something that was called, in 1757, they resorted to something that was called as the Plassey plunder. This you can add to the timeline that we were doing. Okay. That in 1757, the British resorted to what was called as the Plassey plunder. In the Plassey plunder, the British actually imposed huge financial costs on Bengal. They held the British held Bengal as responsible for initiating the war. They held, and since Bengal was defeated, they expected Bengal to pay a huge financial compensation for starting the war. Though the war did not last long, it was merely a surrender, but the British imposed huge financial costs on Bengal, and this is what is termed as the Plassey plunder. So, firstly, under the Plassey plunder, an immediate war indemnity or war compensation, it's one and the same thing. An immediate war indemnity of 2,75,000 pounds was to be paid by Bengal to the British East India Company. Okay. A war compensation of 2,75,000 was to be paid in 1757 immediately as a result of this defeat. Secondly, they said that over the next 4 years, from 1757 to 1760, over the next 4 years, the British East India Company demanded 22.5 million rupees as a war compensation. Okay. So, in the 22, that between 1757 to 1760, the British East India Company demanded that Bengal must pay ₹22.5 million. Okay. Now, basically, what do you see in these two things? That the British East India Company is trying to make a huge financial gain out of the war, right? It is trying to make a huge financial gain out of the war by imposing these costs on whom? Bengal. And in Bengal, the Nawab is whom? Mir Jafar now. Mir Jafar had helped to overthrow Siraj, and basically Mir Jafar becomes a Nawab. Now Mir Jafar realizes if that Bengal has to pay such a huge revenue demand to the British, this would leave little in the finances of the state itself, and this will leave little with the state itself. So Mir Jafar is not very keen on meeting these demands, okay, and especially this demand of 22.5 million rupees. So though Mir Jafar is made the Nawab, he is unwilling to comply with the huge financial demands made by the British. The result is that Mir Jafar was replaced by Mir Qasim. Mir Jafar is replaced by Mir Qasim, who goes on to become the next Nawab, and he is expected to comply with these financial obligations already imposed. Okay, he is expected to comply with these financial obligations already imposed by whom? By the British. Now, so you can write that here, that Mir Jafar failed to comply with the huge revenue demands made by the British East India Company, and thus he was replaced by Mir Qasim. Thus he was replaced by Mir Qasim in 1760. Okay. Now in 1760 Mir Qasim comes to power. Now Mir Qasim is also, though Mir Qasim comes to power, he also faces the same situation, that complying with the huge revenue demands made by the British would leave his empire, or would leave Bengal with little source of revenue. And to that extent, this is something that they are not very keen on complying with either. Now, but what can Mir Qasim do? If Mir Qasim also refuses to comply, then this would do what? It would result probably in his overthrow as well, right? So Mir Qasim understands that there is not much scope of not complying with British demands, and not complying with British demand will have its consequences. So the solution to this, he argues, is that we should do something. We should overthrow the British presence in the region, or we should remove the British presence from Bengal. And this is where you see the beginning of the Battle of Buxar. Okay, this is where you see the beginning for the planning of the Battle of Buxar, where you see that in Awadh, in Bengal and in Delhi. Basically, Bengal was the one where the British already had the trading monopoly. Now, and the British had the trading monopoly, and the British had imposed huge financial costs on Bengal. Who was watching this closely? Awadh. If in Bengal the British had established a presence, it was quite much expected that Awadh was also a prosperous Mughal province, given that it was in the northern plains and the plains of Ganga. Awadh was also a prosperous Mughal province. It was quite much expected. Expected by Awadh that if in Bengal they wanted trading monopoly, they would seek trading monopoly in Awadh also. And trying to seek trading monopoly in Awadh, they will also try to influence the domestic politics of Awadh to increase their influence in the region. Okay, that was the realization within Awadh also, that what had happened in Bengal can happen any day in Awadh as well, whenever the situation is right. So in that context, Awadh at this point of time is ruled by the brother of Siraj, cousin brother of Siraj, and that is Shuja-ud-Dawla. In Delhi, it was, I mean, these names are not that important, Shah Alam II. And in Bengal, we know it was Mir Qasim. In Bengal, it was Mir Qasim. So Mir Qasim led the efforts to join hands with Awadh and the central Mughal ruler, Shah Alam II. And a joint military offensive was prepared by Delhi, Awadh and Bengal against the British. And this is what led to the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Okay. So now it is in this context that you see that Delhi, Awadh and Bengal coming together was a joint military offensive against the British forces. However, in the Battle of Buxar, the joint military offensive led by Mughal successor states turned out to be unsuccessful. If it would have been successful, then the British would have been thrown out. So obviously this was unsuccessful, and in the Battle of Buxar, the forces of the Mughal successor states were defeated. But now will come the question, sir, how is it possible that the British East India Company, a private trading company, can go ahead and defeat the combined forces of Awadh and Bengal together, right? And the involvement of the central Mughal ruler is also there, but it is largely ceremonial in nature, because the largest fighting units were contributed by Awadh and Bengal. So what can explain the defeat of successor Mughal states to the British, even when they are joining hands? The answer for this comes from that firstly, the successor Mughal states are not fighting the British East India Company, they are fighting the British Army. They are fighting the British Army. Now, the British Army had come into India not to fight Bengal and Awadh. The British Army had actually come into India at this time in Hyderabad. And in Hyderabad, the British Army had come to fight the French Army. See, wherever the French East India Company was a government-owned trading company. Remember I told you, right? The French East India Company was a government-owned trading company. Wherever the company went, it was accompanied by the forces of the French Empire. And we'll see when we'll discuss Hyderabad that the British East India Company was not accompanied. Okay, the British East India Company was not accompanied by the British forces. It was a private trading company. But when the French started attacking the British trading positions in Hyderabad, the British East India Company now appealed to their government in Britain to send in additional troops. And that is when the British troops came into India, primarily firstly in the Hyderabad region, to tackle the French. But as they came here to defend British economic interests in Hyderabad, they were also deployed in Bengal, in the Battle of Plassey also, and in the Battle of Buxar also. So first thing you have to understand, they are not fighting the East India Company, they are fighting the British Army. Secondly, the British Army forces were led by one general. Okay, so in terms of coordination and organization, the British forces were a unified lot. Whereas in case of the regional states coming together, their armies were led by their respective leadership coming from different princely states. And it was not that in terms of cohesion also of leadership, there was not one unified command, as it is said. In the British, there was a unified command, whereas here there was not a unified command. A unified command meaning all the orders are coming from one authority from the top. Here the forces of Awadh are coordinating with the forces of Bengal. It's not that there is one commander who is leading the joint forces of Awadh and Bengal. So even in terms of coordination, the British forces were superior. And finally also, as I told you, in terms of technology, right, that there is no major technological modernization introduced since the time of Aurangzeb. So whether it is in technological modernization, whether it is in terms of efficiently coordinating a response, or it is in terms of tackling the British army, the Indian states fell short. And this is the reason why they were defeated in the Battle of Buxar at the hands of the British army. Now, as they get defeated in the Battle of Buxar, you see that in 1764, this is followed by the Treaty of Allahabad, right? Now, in the Treaty of Allahabad, which happened at this point of time, from your prelims point of view, it is important to note, what? It is important to note what are the provisions of the Treaty of Allahabad, okay? That is something that is important to note, okay? Now, firstly, and the significance of this, we will study from mains point of view. What is the significance of these battles of Plassey and Buxar? So, firstly, as a result of the Treaty of Allahabad, the first thing that they do is, देखिए, यहाँ पे they impose a war compensation on Bengal. So now they will impose a war compensation on Awadh, right? Awadh was to pay a war compensation of 5 million rupees. 5 million rupees was the immediate war compensation that Awadh was expected to pay, okay? Secondly, they have trading monopoly in Bengal. They already have trading monopoly, and this is something that we'll write here, Abhi. They already had trading monopoly in Bengal. They got the trading monopoly rights in Bengal with the Plassey plunder. Okay, they're getting, इसी के चक्कर में तो पूरा बवाल हुआ है. Right? All the conflict is starting with the issue of trading monopoly. Right? So they are getting the trading monopoly in Bengal with the Plassey plunder. Now they will say that we want trading monopoly in where? Awadh. क्योंकि Bengal में तो they already have. So okay, from Awadh they've got trading monopoly. From Awadh they've got a war compensation. But Bengal is also involved in the war. In fact, Bengal is the key instigator of the war. So Bengal also will have to pay an additional price. What is that price? Exactly. That Bengal already is trying to pay a huge war compensation, right? Now, apart from war compensation monopoly rights already that Bengal has given, they are now saying that Bengal must provide what? That Bengal must provide something important, and that is that from Bengal they wanted revenue collection rights. From Bengal they want revenue collection rights. Why revenue collection rights from Bengal? Primarily because Bengal had a huge amount, had a flourishing economy, right? And had high agricultural productivity. So revenue generated from Bengal would be significant. So they demanded Diwani rights from Bengal, meaning that a portion of the revenue collected from Bengal would be going to the British East India Company. Now war compensation will come once, but once you get revenue collecting rights, it will become a permanent source of revenue, right? So the East India Company is coming as a private trading company, but now is moving in the direction of becoming an organization which is not behaving merely as a trading group, but is also developing long-term economic stakes in the region, okay? And is behaving not merely as a trading group with getting Diwani rights. They are having an interest in the administration of the region also, okay? But they are only taking an interest in the revenue administration to begin with. So as they get the Diwani rights, in Bengal, we say that the Treaty of Allahabad, with the Treaty of Allahabad, there is a dual system of administration which begins in Bengal. Under this dual system of administration, the rule still happened in the name of the Nawab. The day-to-day administrative aspects were also looked over by the Nawab and the rulers and the native rulers of Bengal. However, in terms of revenue collection, the East India Company was to have a significant say. So this is the dual system of administration that comes after the Treaty of Allahabad. So that is why we say that with the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, the British started establishing their indirect rule in Bengal. But आप पूछेंगे कि sir, why indirect rule? If they have defeated Bengal, then why should they settle only for indirect rule? Language, people will revolt. Dil mange more. Why not dil mange more? Why only settle for indirect rule? The major reason is that the East India Company is a private trading company. Why should it take over the administration of the state and the responsibilities when come with it when you are already getting the money? आप सोच नहीं रहे हैं कंपनी की तरह. Why should I take up the additional burden of administration if I am already getting what one will get after administration? If you have rights without any responsibilities of administration, if you're making economic gains without any taking over any headache of administration, then that is a better deal to have. Also, it does something important. Rather than the local people revolting, it is important to know that the British also were sensible, or the British East India Company realized that if they were to completely displace the local rulers, they will again rise and protest. So even after defeating the opponent or the local native rulers, the British would leave them with enough authority so that they have an incentive to cooperate with the British. Okay? If a total displacement would happen, then they would continue to revolt against the British. And if that is not, and if they are allowed to retain their privileges, then rule will still happen in their name. They have every incentive to come to a negotiation or a settlement with the British. So the British East India Company is doing this rather than displacing the local rulers, because it would trigger more revolts, unnecessary wars, unnecessary costs for the East India Company. Anyways, they have no much interest. If they are getting the money without the administration, then why do they need to? So that is something, how they establish their presence in the region. Now, what is the significance of this? From your mains point of view, see, we often say, and you've heard before also, you would have heard before also, that the Battle of Plassey and Buxar were important because the British established their foothold into India. What you would have heard is that with the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, the British rule in India began. But that is incorrect. It is incorrect to say that the British rule in India began with the Battle of Plassey and Buxar. It is more correct to say that the British only established their presence in the region substantively with the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, because it is nowhere, they were nowhere close to becoming a pan-Indian power at this point of time. They are only becoming a major entity. Yes, they established their presence because they have defeated one of the most prosperous Mughal states. So they established their presence in the region. But there are other powerful regional states also. There are Marathas. We'll see this later. Marathas are also there at this point of time. And in fact, the territorial extent of the Marathas is the largest in the early 1760s, till the 1760s, till the Third Battle of Panipat. Or there is Mysore also. So there are powerful regional states like Mysore, like Marathas, which were also significant players. So it is not clear that the British are going to rule India in either 1757 or 1764. It is not clear. But what becomes clear is that they are a major player. But only now that we have a benefit of hindsight, we say that with Battle of Plassey or Battle of Buxar, the British rule in India began. It is nowhere clear. Yes, what began was partly British indirect rule only in portions of Bengal. That is it. Okay. That is what is the significance of the Battle of Plassey and Buxar. Okay. Anything on one more significance, on one or two more points about significance that you must know is that from Battle of Plassey and Buxar, what are they getting? A substantial financial benefit, right? And the East India Company's finances received a huge benefit from the Battle of Plassey and Buxar. And the finances received from here were partly used to compensate for what? The cost of wars that the East India Company was to fight. The cost of wars, देखिए East India Company was fighting wars, I told you, in Hyderabad also. See, East India Company meaning East India Company is involved in the wars in Hyderabad also. It is involved in the wars in Bengal also. So part of the revenue generated from the Plassey plunder or by getting revenue collecting rights in Bengal is giving the revenue which will help them fund their wars in India. I will talk about the relationship between the East India Company and the army separately. Okay, or if you want, I'll just explain this here. That what do you see is that the British army was deployed in the region to fight wars, right? It is deployed even in the Battle of Buxar. Now, to protect the interest of whom? The British East India Company, right? But why should they protect the interest of one private trading company, one private British trading company, by going all the way to India? Why? Yes, there is rivalry between the English and the French, that is one thing, but what else? To establish their empire. They were being, yes, they were being paid for that, in the sense that the British East India Company agreed to pay to the British Parliament an annual dividend of roughly equivalent to 3,76,000 pounds a year. So roughly around 3,76,000. So roughly around 3,76,000 pounds a year would be paid as an annual dividend by the British East India Company to the British Parliament. In return for what? The British Army supporting the British East India Company. So if the British East India Company has to pay a budgetary support to the British Parliament, देखिए budget British Parliament को पैसा जा रहा है, मतलब किसी politician की जेब में नहीं जा रहा है, it is going to the budget. Okay, so in return for this budgetary support that British East India Company extended to the British Parliament, the British Parliament is assuring the support of the British Army to the East India Company in India. But how does the East India Company pay this amount? Partly from war compensations or from the revenue collecting rights from Bengal. So in a way, the financial gains made by the British East India Company from Plassey as well as from Buxar were partly used to fund the maintenance of British troops or fund the fighting of wars by the East India Company in India. That's another significance. There is one more thing, okay, and this is something that I have not explained till now. I'll just explain and then we'll write. The imposition of war compensation. See, the point is that always a winner will impose terms on the loser. Okay, and I mean even in times of British, even in times of Mughals, etc., the Mughals would also impose conditions on the defeated parties. Okay, so obviously in terms the victorious, see, why are you fighting war? There is an objective with which everybody is fighting war. This objective can vary from place to place. Now the East India Company is not seeking territorial concessions, right? Because it does not wish to establish a direct rule at any point of time. So what it is seeking is financial gains. That is why it is imposing these conditions. The Mughals sought to impose or take territorial gains. We will see Marathas, they also sought financial gains. So every winner in a war would try to seek gains according to their own interest. Okay. So here they are seeking financial gains. Marathas, for example, sought financial gains. The Mughals sought more territorial gains. So that depended on the approach of each of these ruling parties. That is there. And we'll discuss, for example, when we discuss Marathas, you will see that. Now, one of the things also as an impact that we not talked about here and we can talk about is a shift in the nature of trade that happens as a result of Buxar. Okay, a shift in the nature of trade between the East India Company and Indian traders. ये पॉइंट मैं इसलिए भी बता रहा हूं क्योंकि ऐसा भी आपको प्रीलिम्स में वो क्वेश्चन भी देख सकते हैं कि विद रिस्पेक्ट टू द बैटल ऑफ बक्सर विच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग स्टेटमेंट्स आर ट्रू, दैट देयर वाज अ शिफ्ट इन द नेचर ऑफ trade. Now what do you mean by this? Basically, see, I told you Indian traders were selling goods to the East India Company, which was selling it goods in Europe. Now there's something that I did not tell you, and this is something which is pretty obvious, is that there is something that's called the balance of trade. Balance of trade depends on, if suppose Indian how much amount of export Indian traders, or how much amount of worth of goods Indian traders are selling to East India Company, and how much amount of goods it is importing from East India Company. If the Indian traders are exporting more than importing, then that is a positive balance of trade. In whose favor? Indian favor, or in the favor of, so if there is this, then the balance of trade is in the favor of Indian traders. Now international trade at this point of time used to happen in gold. International trade at this time used to happen in bullion or gold. Okay, international trade at this time used to happen in bullion or gold, and if it was happening in bullion or gold, then if we are exporting more, so we are getting gold, and we are importing, so we have to give gold. Net balance of bullion or gold is in whose favor? Indian traders. So this trading activity was beneficial for Indian traders, and it resulted in a net influx of bullion in where? In India. Right? It resulted in a net influx of bullion in India. So what is this? This is Sone ki chidiya. That is why we used to say that we are exporters. For example, we were the world's biggest textile exporter at this point of time. So there is a net influx of gold into India. But once the East India Company wins in the Battle of Buxar, they are generating what? They are generating revenue from Bengal. Now with this revenue from Bengal, the East India Company now would buy goods from Indian producers and Indian traders. They anyways had the monopoly of doing trade, right? And now they are using the revenue generated from Bengal to buy the goods from Indian producers and Indian traders, meaning that they are no longer paying them in bullion. So they could either buy directly from Indian producers now, or even if they were buying from Indian traders, they were paying them from the revenue generated from Bengal. So they need not bring bullion or hard currency to pay for their trading activities. Now you will say, sir, आप तो उससे क्या फर्क पड़ रहा है? They still have to pay. अरे ultimately they are using the revenue generated from Bengal to buy goods, and then they'll sell it in Europe. So basically, ultimately it is doing what? Ultimately they are increasing their profits, and most importantly they don't have to spend gold. Why? Because till a long period of time currencies were always pegged against gold. देखिए एक आपको इंटरेस्टिंग बात बताता हूँ, थोड़ा सा जीवन में इंटरेस्ट भी बहुत ज़रूरी है, और यूपीएससी में भी आना चाहिए इंटरेस्ट थोड़ा थोड़ा. That one of the things is that when you look at if I tear a piece of paper from your copy and write this is 1 crore, you will say 2 crore, right? What is the worth of a piece of paper? Nothing. But that is what you all give a worth to. Ultimately, you have a 100 rupee note or a 500 rupee note or a 2000 rupee note. That is something that is assumed to have a worth of its own, when in reality it does not. Right? In reality, it has no worth of its own. Historically, till the 1970s, a country would issue a currency only on the basis of amount of gold it had. Why gold? Why currencies were pegged against gold? Why do you think? इंट्रिंसिक वैल्यू है गोल्ड का. पत्थर है, पत्थर फेंक के मारोगे, यही इंट्रिंसिक वैल्यू है. Why? Demand.
Whatever, अगर पत्थर की भी demand होगी, it will be adding its values in the market.
Okay, demand, because there is demand for gold.
Ornaments.
Come. Most importantly, that is partly what you're saying is true. Rather than demand or having an intrinsic value of its own, it is not availability, it is constancy. That the amount of gold is almost fixed. You can't make gold. Alchemists historically have always tried to make gold. Why? Because making gold is impossible. Or you can only make it under nuclear fusion or those kinds of technologies which nobody has. Right? So making gold is almost impossible, and the total amount of gold on earth is fixed. So if something is fixed, meaning you can't add something to it or somebody can take out something to it. So gold becomes one of those things which, apart from looking attractive, when if golden can look attractive, anything can look attractive is my viewpoint anyways. But nonetheless, if that is the case also, it is something which is constant, and that is why nobody can change it. If nobody can change it, it has an intrinsic value of its own. It is fixed. That is why Bitcoin. Why is Bitcoin a currency? Is because you can't make a Bitcoin of your own. It has to be the next prime number. Only there are a certain number of fixed number of Bitcoins today. You can't be mining many more. It's almost stabilized as a currency, right? So one thing for a currency to be fixed is ऐसा नहीं है कि आपने अपना नोट छाप लिया, okay? And that must have a certain amount of value, and it must be honored by all parties. Gold was honored by all parties in international trade because everybody knew that it is fixed in amount. So that is why gold was very crucial. Having pieces of iron, pieces of copper did not mean anything as long as they could not be bartered with gold. So gold was the ultimate commodity to own, the real signifier of wealth. Now this entry into India stopped after the Battle of Buxar. Okay, after the Battle of Buxar, the British are no longer bringing in bullion from outside India to buy goods from India. Rather, they are using the revenue generated from Bengal to further finance their trading activities in Bengal. And so that is also the significance of Battle of Buxar. There is a shift in the nature of trade, meaning what? Partly that no longer the flow of bullion happened into India, and also the revenue generated from Bengal is being used for further expanding the trading activities and also for financing their military expansion in other areas. That is the significance of these battles. Is this point clear? Why did it not happen after the Battle of Plassey? Because in the Battle of Plassey, they are not getting the revenue from Bengal. So it is not.
Diwali rights from at the time of Battle of Plassey also.
See, yes, I'll tell you this also. If you're asking, so I'm telling, it's not required at your examination level. It's okay to know also. For example, Farrukhsiyar had granted certain minting rights, certain coin minting rights to the East India Company. But this was later revoked by Muhammad Shah, and more importantly, Muhammad Shah also did not revoke it. He was also in favor of continuing it. But Murshid Quli rejected granting them any coin minting rights. Though Farrukhsiyar had granted them, and Muhammad Shah had also talked about continuing them, but Murshid Quli refused to obey them. And that is why this was never effectively that they were getting any revenue rights. It is only after Buxar that they are actually getting revenue collection rights from Bengal.
It is the same thing like we call it as dastak.
Dastak is different thing. Dastak is the private trading rights. Dastaks were, देखिए क्या है, अभी East India just because you're asking, so I'm telling. Exam में, I don't think so anybody is going to ask you. But misuse of dastaks also is often cited as a reason for these wars breaking out. What was dastak? Dastak was private trading right. East India Company would come and it would get trading rights, or for the trade that they would do, their trade would be taxed. Okay? But in addition to, so East India Company officials would come to do trade, but they would say कि अगर हम East India के company के लिए खरीद रहे हैं तो अपने लिए भी खरीद लेते हैं, हम individually भी trade कर लेंगे. So if we are buying on behalf of East India Company 1000 tons, 5 tons we will buy on our behalf only, take it in the same ship and sell it privately in Europe. So this was private trade. So, but the East India Company had to pay taxes on the trade that it was doing. But a large number of these East India Company officials were indulging in this parallel trade. That was almost corruption, and it was leading to a loss of revenue for the local rulers in India also. So they decided to crack down on this, and only to selective individuals tax-free trading rights were extended. These were called as dastaks. Okay. So dastaks is a different thing. This is a different thing. Is that clear? Anything else? Anything more you want to ask? You can think of it, ask later also. Yeah.
Sir, it is sometimes said that Battle of Plassey was not actually.
It is not, it is the siege of Arcot. रुक जाइए ना, अभी आए तो वहाँ हैदराबाद पे जब आएंगे, it is often sometimes argued, he is saying, and it is rightly said, that it is often sometimes argued that it is not the Battle of Plassey with which the British established their presence in India. It was perhaps in Hyderabad in 1751 in the siege of Arcot, okay, that they actually established their presence. तो वो पहले जब हम हैदराबाद आएंगे तो वहाँ मैं बताऊंगा ये बात.
My question is a bit different, sir.
हाँ.
I was asking that it is sometimes said that the Battle of Plassey was not actually a battle.
It is.
It was a conspiracy or one side.
तो वो हमने बात तो कर ही ली ना कि the Battle of Plassey is not actually a battle, it is merely a skirmish. It is